good, church? What a beautiful day it has been today. The Lord allowed me to get a little siesta today, which hasn't been happening for Sundays, but a good siesta is nice when you can get it. So I do thank Him for that, for all of His blessings. This evening we'll start the book of Exodus on, like I said, my favorite, I hate to say favorite of all characters, because Christ has got to be the favorite, but in the Old Testament, Moses is probably the person I can relate to the most, and one of the fellows I long to see and talk to when we get to heaven. Just sit down and chat with him. But we'll start in the book of Exodus chapter 1, and I believe last time I asked you to see if you can find some information on some things. Did I not? Maybe some Pharaoh names and things, and we'll talk about them here in just a minute if anyone looked at those. Because most of Hollywood has it wrong when they start showing movies. I guess they want something easy to pronounce, but if you study it, you'll find most of their names are not easy to pronounce. So we'll start in Exodus chapter 1, and we'll start in verse 1, but I'm not going to read for about the first six verses. We're just going to talk about them. Because if you look in Exodus 1, verse 1, it starts giving us the name of all the children of Israel, right? So all these are here. And we get all the way down to verse 5. It says that the souls were 70 because Joseph was already in Egypt. Now it's talking about there, of course, about who? Jacob's family, right? That he had 70 blood relatives, and that's where the core group started. Verse 6 is where we'll start reading. It says, "And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful, and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceedingly mighty. And the land was filled with them." Now, here we go. We start out with 70, and notice what it said. They waxed exceedingly what? Mighty. Powerful. So, it's not just 70 people any longer, is it? It's probably not 100 or a couple hundred. We're probably in the hundreds of thousands by now. Hundreds of thousands of people. And you think out of those many, there's a lot of able-bodied men that could have been an army. So they're in this land of Egypt, and while everybody knows each other, it's all well and good. But what happens after folks start dying off? They don't know each other anymore. If you think about it, isn't that sort of what's happened in our communities now? Everybody that known each other has passed away, and their children may be coming back or moving out. And 9 times out of 10, most folks can't name 5 of their 10 neighbors. I don't know who they are. Oh, so-and-so passed away, and somebody bought their house. Well, that's sort of where we are in this time period. Everyone that knew each other had gone. So now this Hebrew nation is starting to emerge inside the borders of Egypt. Then if you look, remember in if we go back in our minds to Sunday school, do you remember what Joseph did for Pharaoh? What did Joseph do for Pharaoh? Well, interpreted his dreams, and Pharaoh brought him out of that jail and put him in second in command and did all of this, and he brought his brothers to him during the drought. But during the drought, Joseph helped the Pharaoh make out like a bandit, didn't he? He went from just not only being the king, he truly become, and forgive me for saying this, a living God. And you say, well, why do you say that, Carl? He owned the land. He owned the people. He owned the cat. This is where everything was taken into the government.
And he was able to get it without making everybody mad at him.
They gave it to him.
Right.
They gave it up to survive. That was their bargain. So now the king is, kings were always powerful, but now the king had everything. So, evidently that king was a good king. Took care of Joseph's family, took care of the land. But just because he's good, does that mean the next one's going to be good? Or the next one? Nope, doesn't work like that. So we see in verse 8, there arose a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the children of Israel are more and mightier than we are. Here you go. We have a foreign nation living inside your borders. What would that look like today? A foreign nation living inside a country's borders.
That's what I just said, America. I just said it. Just said
Yeah, I'm honest, right? What foreign nation do we have living here? You have any foreign, we used to be a melting pot. You come in and they were assimilated and it hand in hand. Now, it's not like that. You have these groups and this group and this group. Now, our invaders, the nation inside of a nation, is more a religious nation. They had the nation of Islam inside our country. And the thing about it, many of them look like you and I do. They're not your traditional Arab peoples. Now they look just like us, except they're part of the Muslim religion. And anytime you get a foreign body inside a country, if we look at Europe and what's happened over there, Africa, what's happened over there in the last 100 years, civil wars, they're still fighting because they have folks living inside their borders that's not the same people. They're not the same people. If you go back to our country before the white settlers came, the Indians, they all had their different areas, didn't they? And they fought each other constantly over hunting grounds, over their parts of our continent. And when we came, we said, well, no, it's all going to be one country. It's hard to do that. So now this king of Egypt's kind of getting afraid. These folks could, what would happen if someone would attack us and the Hebrews joined forces with them? They could conquer us easily. He said, we've got to do something. In verse 10, he says, come on, look here, come on, let's deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass, and when we are faileth in our war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built the Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramesses. So they went from being a mighty nation now to being a nation of slaves. Now, how do you think that worked? How do you think that happened? Did it happen overnight? No, it happened over time. They started pushing them into one place, settling them into one place, putting governors over them. To this time, a lot of those Hebrews were governors, was leaders. Stepped right into Joseph, his ranks, and he filled up the leadership with them. They were smart, they were strong, they knew what they were doing. So he said, well, we're going to put them to good use. We're not going to let them have time to plot against us. We're going to make them work. They're going to build cities. And the movie that I love to look at that is the Old Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston. When they're in the brick pits and they're in there, you're making bricks. You take mud, clay, put it together, put straw in it, and you bake it in the sun, hard as a rock. That's how they made their bricks in those days. People power. And they just didn't build a building, they built cities. Now, can you imagine how many bricks it took to make cities? So that's why it took 30, 40, 50 years to build cities. It would take a generation, 2 or 3 generations to build these cities. So after time, they went from being a nation of powerful folks inside their country to a nation of slaves in that land of Goshen where they lived. And it was horrific, it was ugly, it was brutal. And they did something else to try to hold them down. What was one of the first horrific things that Egypt did to the Hebrew people? Say it again, loud.
They wanted to kill all of their little boys.
Why did they... What was the other reason they wanted them killed? There was 2 reasons. One, they didn't want them to multiply anymore. The other was a story about a deliverer, wasn't it? They knew that there was somebody coming eventually to deliver them. Well, what's the best way to stop a birth? Well, you don't know when it's going to be born. What's the best way to eliminate a threat of a young child when you don't know who it is? Kill them all. Does that sound familiar? Has that ever happened after that? Happened numerous times. With Moses, it happened actually twice. So, as we keep going, if we keep going in verse 12, it says, but they more afflicted them, the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage and mortar and brick and all manner of service in the field. And all their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, which names one was Sapphira and the other was Pua. I don't know how to pronounce that, bless her heart. She's dead and gone, she don't know it. And he said, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them upon the stool, if it be a son, ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. And the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said unto them, why have ye done this thing, and have saved the men children alive? And the midwives said unto him, Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as Egyptian women, for they are lively and not delivered of the midwives coming to them. In other words, they were delivering their own babies. They were strong, they were healthy, they weren't like the Egyptians, they didn't need us. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mightily. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save. So now he's put out this decree. Not only, was he told the midwives, that didn't work. Okay, we'll take it out of your hands. I'll make it a decree that if you have a baby boy, you got to throw him in the river. Now, if you wanted to control a population, who should you kill? The men or the women? Who? Women. Exactly. Last time I looked, men couldn't have children. Now, and you say, well, what are you talking about there? Well, most of the population of the world is made up of what? It's nearly 3-to-1 women to men. Nearly 3-to-1, more women than men. Now, they were doing this to try to control their numbers. Also, though, they wanted to eliminate some of the men coming up, so they wouldn't be soldiers, wouldn't be warriors. The nation of women could still what? Work. They could still put them to work as slaves. Absolutely.
Easier to control too, but women were easier to control.
I don't know about that.
Well, I mean,
as far as wars and things like that, probably yes.
They thought that women were easier to physically. The women were easier to control.
Absolutely.
They didn't have the strong men there to.
And they could still bring the Hebrew women in as slaves into the households and do basically anything a man could do.
Right.
So they were still going to make out with that.
You're never going to shut our mouths.
No. Bless your heart. I'm not getting that one. I got an election coming up next month. I'm not going to rock that boat. I'll talk to y'all about that in July. We'll be all right. So as we see that, now, did it name the Pharaoh in there? Just said the Pharaoh, right? The king. Now, if you watch the movie, did you find it? Do you have that particular Pharaoh? Now, when this decree, say Ramses didn't even exist here. That's Hollywood. That's Hollywood. It's easy to pronounce. He was one of the greatest of the great. But the Pharaoh at this period of time, his name was Amenhotep. He was the first in this line of pharaohs. Amen. History book.
Where'd you find that at?
In the Bible? It's not in the Bible. Well, you have to look at the dates. Yep, history. I got it right here. It's not going to be in your Bible. There's no pharaohs named in the Bible.
That's why we came up with Pharaoh.
No, Pharaoh means king. Pharaoh's not a name, it's a title. So, the king at that time was Amenhotep. No, Ramses was long after this. Yeah. Ramesses was the city, yeah. But Ramses was not the pharaoh at this time. Actually, you won't find very much about the pharaohs of this time because they were so hated for what happened. They destroyed their monuments. They took their names off of nearly everything there was in Egypt because this changed the way of life for Egypt for hundreds of years. When they lost their slaves, when they lost their workers, when they lost their army, it devastated Egypt. And if you look today, Egypt is, in that corner of the world, at one time they were the world's power. What are they today? I mean, a little bit, but not like it was. They had the known world conquered at one time, and they lost it. Why? I will bless them that bless you, and I will curse them that curse you. If we look in around the 1530s BC, that was the time that this Pharaoh, and remember BC goes backwards. It goes from like 2000 down to 0. And if you really put the timetable together, Christ was born in about 2 BC, even though we say it's before Christ and after, in the year of our Lord, not after death, Anno Domini AD. But BC goes backwards. So in about 1530 BC is when this Pharaoh come to power, when he was eliminating the children of Israel, and he was hated. Absolutely hated. Because you can imagine these children, these Hebrew people lived amongst the Egyptians. They had Egyptian friends, Egyptian brothers. I don't mean blood brothers, but friends, grew up with each other. And when he made this decree, they was like, what are you doing? Because common people, let me ask you this. Does poor people, even though if you're a different race, creed, religion, whatever, have more in common than poor and rich people have in common? Sure. Poor people of any race or creed have more in common than a rich person and a poor person. Right? That's what they were always afraid of in America, in the Soviet Union, that all the poor people would get together and overthrow the government. But we can't do that because we're poor. We can't do that. Can't do it. So they were hurt. They were hurting. And actually this Pharaoh was not a very good person. Now, as the story unfolds, we know that Moses' mother did what? We know she did exactly what God did what? Told him to do, but yet in a different way. In verse 2, in chapter 2, it says, "And there were a man of the house of Levi, and took to him a daughter of Levi." Now here we go. Who is this we're talking about? Moses' mother and dad. What was their names? Do you remember? What? Now that's actually in there, not in that particular part of the scripture. Amram and Jochebed. That was his mother and father, and they were both of the tribe of what? Levi. Levi were the what? Priests. So Aaron was the first priest, so to speak, but Moses was of the same house and lineage. And we keep going. It says, "And a woman conceived and bare a son, and when she saw him, he was a goodly child, and she hid him 3 months." Wow. 3 months she hid this newborn. And look what it says. "And when she could no longer hide him, she took him in an ark of bulrushes." A what of bulrushes? An ark. We always call it a basket, don't we? What's she call it? Wouldn't be the first time an ark sailed upon the water, would it? "And dubbed it with slime and with pitch." Imagine that. Pitch is like a tar material. That's what they sealed the ark with. The original ark. "And she put the child therein, laid him in the flags by the river's brink, and his sister stood afar off." Remember, we know this little story, okay? "Pushes him in the water, and he sails down the river, and Miriam goes watching him, right? Where'd he wind up? Now, Pharaoh's daughter. Now remember, this Pharaoh just decreed that all the men children got to be killed, right? And she's down at the river's edge, and here comes the basket, the ark. The ark. Now, she should have been his enemy, right? Okay. Now, as Lois 1 and Lois 2 has pointed out, these names you'll not find in the Scriptures. Who pulled him out of the river? Pharaoh's daughter, but what was her name? Oddly enough, she also served as Pharaoh for many years when her father and her brother died. This is a very cool time period to study, actually. Her name was Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut. You have to look it up in time periods. It's not in Scriptures. None of this is in the Scriptures. You can't find it in the Bible. Cannot find these names in the Bible. Hatshepsut. And she drew him from the water. Because remember, he was able to actually become Pharaoh. He could have become Pharaoh. If you study the Scriptures, he was a prince of Egypt. A prince is in line to be what? King. So, Pharaoh's daughter took him in, raised him. Now, did she know what he was and who he was? The daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash at the river, and her handmaidens walked along the river's side. And when she saw the ark, this is Miriam, when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him, said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." This is verse 6 of chapter 2. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, this is Miriam talking to Pharaoh's daughter, right? "Shall I go and call thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" Well, that's just a coincidence, honey. Absolutely. You go get that woman. Who did she go get? Mommy. Yeah. See how that worked out? Now here's the Hebrew child, right? She's got him. And here's his sister saying, ooh, I know someone that can nurse him. Now, if she was a good Egyptian, what should she have done? Without the ark. There you go. But it said she had compassion on him. I wonder. Then Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, "Take this child away and nurse it for me." This is to the child. This is actually Moses' mother. "And I will give thee wages." And the woman said, and the woman took the child and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son, and she called his name Moses, because she drew him out of the water. And that's what Moses means, out of the water. Out of the water or out of the Nile. And I'm sure it was paid enough to keep the entire family decent. Keep the entire family well. Now, she knew exactly, the Pharaoh's daughter knew exactly who Moses was, what he was, where he came from, right? And she probably wasn't dumb enough to think that probably was not his mother. It's not in the Scriptures, it's not in history, but she probably knew that was Moses' mother and that was Moses' little sister that was right there with him. But she loved Moses. Now, if you watch the Ten Commandments, it's because she couldn't have a son and blah, blah, blah. That's not in here. I can't give you that. But I do know she loved the child and took him in as, what does it say? Her son. Her son. Now, when it came to pass in those days as Moses was grown, that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. And he spied an Egyptian. And here's we see Moses living in the palace. We see him growing up. And he finally went out when he was a man. Now, it doesn't say a whole lot about in between. But you can imagine if he's the son, the recognized son of Pharaoh's daughter, how was he raised? As a prince. He was a prince. Pharaoh's daughter, if Pharaoh would die without an heir, it would go to her. If she died, it would go to him. Very educated. And if you study the Bible, Moses was actually a military genius. And he passed that military genius along to Joshua. How in the world would he get military training being a slave? Wasn't raised a slave. I'm sure he was in the military of Egypt. As a prince, well, look at our country. How many presidents have we had that had no military service? I can put it on one hand. Anybody know the answer to that question? I know our current president. Did Clinton serve?
George Bush didn't serve.
He was in the reserves, wasn't he?
His dad was.
So that used to be the prerequisite, right? You had to have military service to carry you to that catapult you to that level. So for Moses to become leader, don't you think he probably would have had some military training? He may have even been a commander of the armies. If you watch the Charlton Heston version, Moses is commander of the armies of Egypt. It's not in the Bible, but it's a possibility. It is a very good possibility.
But you wonder if the people around him, whether they resented the fact that they knew he had to be.
I'm sure a lot of them knew, but also it wasn't like, now, here we go again. We want to see Charlton Heston as Moses. Moses was not blonde hair and blue eye. I'll tell you right now, Moses would have had dark hair, dark complexion, and brown eyes. He would have been an Arab, which is a Jew. Jews are Arab, the same thing. That's a nationality. They'd look the same, right? Basically the same. But inside him, God was still dealing with him. All that time, God was preparing him to be the leader of Israel for that time period. So he put him where he could use him, first to save his life. But notice what God did. He took him out of death, put him in the palace, but put him back with his mother to grow up with his parents, to know who they were, who his brothers and sisters were. Come back to the palace, grew up to be an adult man. And it doesn't say anything else until he gets to that point. And as an adult man, then he went back out and saw. Saul. What did he see? So as he walks out of the palace, I'm sure he was very busy with education, with whatever he was doing. When he finally went to see his people, the treasure cities or whatever they were building, can you picture this? They may have already started building his treasure city. Who knows? I don't know this. I like history. I really enjoy history. And this is where, if you study it, you can outlay it. Because time in the Bible, you can actually go right along with it and see time in history too. You just got to compare the years. Scientists, you can't work with them, but historians you can. Scientists say the earth is 50 billion years old, but historians and Bible theologians are pretty close on the time periods. So you have Moses' mother, Moses' adopted mother. Now they're on two sides, right? Moses sees his people. He sees what he could have. Now think about this. What if Moses would have stayed an Egyptian, become Pharaoh, and freed his people? Wasn't God's plan. But that would have been very possible, couldn't it? He was king. He could have done anything he wanted to do. Well, there's a problem. Well, I want us to think about something here. Pharaoh's daughter ended up having a son. A true Egyptian heir. Now, who would Daddy want to sit on the throne? And here's where I'm going with this. Keeping true with the Old Testament, the younger child, here we go again, the younger child See what I'm saying? It's continuing all the way up even to this point. Moses would not have been king because he was not Egyptian. The moment his brother, his stepbrother, which was Tutmosis III, we want to call him Ramses, but his actually was Tutmosis III, was born, they knew there was your Pharaoh. Moses was still treated well, but it wasn't God's plan. Imagine if it was God's plan for Moses to have been Pharaoh, okay, let my people go. There's a difference in letting them go and leading them out. What did God want Moses to do? Lead them out. Okay, so now we're in the time of history. Moses is, a little bit older. What happens to him when he goes out and sees these people? He sees all these things happening to them. Now, let's look and see what it says here. Let's look at the scriptures. And it came to pass in those days, as Moses was grown, he went out, looked on their burdens, and he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now, when in the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, this is a beautiful scene. They play it out like he's this great miracle worker, comes into the right time and stops it. What does this scripture tell you he did?
He's sneaky.
He looked around and said, He planned this. If you're going to do something in the heat of the moment, you go do it. You don't look around. You don't. Is anybody go? But here he looked around, and he killed him, and he hid his body in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together, and they said to him that he did wrong. Now wait a minute. Here's 2 Hebrews saying he did wrong. Why did he do wrong? Killed. Now these are not Egyptians, right? And he said, "Wherefore smitest thy fellow?" In other words, you're an Egyptian. Why'd you kill this other Egyptian?
See, he's looking for the Egyptians, not for the Hebrews.
And this is what he said. And he said, "Who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killest the Egyptian?" And Moses feared that surely this thing is known. The Hebrews found out. So now you think the Hebrews had any love for Moses? According to that, they really didn't know him. They probably didn't remember him as the kid. It was probably kind of a hush-hush kind of thing. Pharaoh's daughter probably said, "Here, you take this back. Don't tell anybody. Here's money. Here's food."
Well, it would have had to have been because they wanted them all that were that age
Killed.
Yeah, they wanted all the boys that were that age killed, and he would have been killed.
And think about this. What jealousy would that have created amongst the Hebrew women, knowing she got to keep her baby? Now, people are vindictive, and I'm going to say women are even worse than men about that, because they'll sit around and plan. We just kind of react. Women, you'll calculate this stuff out. You'll sit down for months and plan this out. That's why I sleep with one eye open when I've been bad for a couple of weeks, just to make sure, just look at that. But they would have told Pharaoh instantly. I guarantee they'd have told him, "Hey, y'all killed my baby. She still got hers." But can you imagine when the royal whoever carried Moses back to the house, they probably said, "This is Pharaoh's daughter's child. We want you to nurse it." I'm sure someone said, "Well, it looks an awful lot like your kid." "Oh, no, we threw him in the river." They did throw him in the river. No lie there, is it? I put my son in the river. So now Moses is saying, "Well, there's something going on. They've caught me here. I killed the Egyptian because he was whipping my brother or doing this to one of my brothers. Now my brothers are going to dime me out to Pharaoh." Because they didn't consider him a brother. They considered him an Egyptian. So now when Pharaoh heard this thing, here we go. Someone squealed. He sought to slay Moses. Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian. All right. Now, when Moses left left Egypt to Midian, this is a beautiful thing in the Ten Commandments of Charlton Heston. Ramses comes and hugs it. You know, it's Hollywood, right? He was running for his life. He left. He had to go. He had to go. There was no hugs and kisses and goodbye. He grabbed what he could and left out over the sands. Now, why was he running? So what was Moses then? A murderer? He was a murderer. Even if you do it for the right reason, you're still a murderer. He killed someone in cold blood. He planned that out. Because remember, he looked. I mean, someone hurts my kid, I react. I don't look around, so who's going to see me react? I don't care. I'm going to react. Hurting my wife, one of you, you're my family, I will react. I'm not going to say, So, Moses, you said, well, he didn't have he wasn't obeying the Ten Commandments. God hadn't given them to him yet. Hold on. He'll give them to him eventually. We're a few weeks away from that. But I want you to see what Moses came from. He didn't have any love for the Hebrews. He didn't have any love for the Hebrew God. He didn't know God. He was raised Egyptian with all these Egyptian gods that are just ugly-looking little boogers. I mean, they're all weird, messed up, half animals, half humans, and all these different things. And if you go back and study history, even the priests, they didn't believe in these they made up the gods because the priest was the ruling class in Egypt. Because their religion was their government. Their Pharaoh was worshipped as God. And, I'm sorry?
Would have told him something about her religion.
I don't know. Well, you've got to think too here. They didn't know much of their religion. They didn't have... They knew how to sacrifice, and that's about it. Because they didn't have the temple. They hadn't had the Ten Commandments yet. They were living in a foreign land and been here for countless years now. Who knows what they worshiped? Because remember, they said they was promised a deliverer.
Right, that's the one thing
That was it. That was pretty much their binding thing, that God promised them a deliverer. But they had no leaders inside there. After Jacob died, that was really the last of the great leaders. Joseph was a leader, but he was an Egyptian leader, not one of their people. He adapted their culture, married one of their wives, had Egyptian children. So he was pulled away from that. So they really didn't have that kind of leadership until Moses. He brought leadership really back to them. But it shows you what God sometimes has to do to put a leader in place. Moses, look at his family. You think his family life was messed up? Yeah. I mean, it would have to have been a horrific childhood. Hey, I'm sure he don't remember being thrown into the river. Don't remember being pulled out of the river. But he probably remembered the day he was taken from his wet nurse's house, mommy's house, to the palace. He probably remembers getting his hair cut because Egyptian little boys, their princes, they would shave their head bald except for one lock of hair going down the back. And Hebrew children had hair. So he probably remembered a change there, probably didn't have scented sheets and silk and things in the other house, and in the palace, he had everything. Had all these toys, and all of a sudden he had servants. When he walked, they would have bowed. Because he was still been the Prince of Egypt. Even as a baby, been Prince of Egypt. So he had all that transition. Then imagine growing up with being educated and powerful, and people jumped when the moment you spoke or walked into the room. And then when God started revealing to him who he was. Now, here, what does it say? When he was a grown man? Now, people vary on age here. What do you think a grown man would have been probably in the Bible?
He was 40 years old.
No, when he was a grown man, when he left the palace. He was about 4 years old when he went to the palace, wasn't he? That's about the time you start forming memories. How old was he when he left the palace as a grown man? 40? Is that what you did? 40. I thought you said 4. I'm sorry. I thought you said 4.
Acts 7:23.
So when he 40, here's a 40-year-old man. Now that's middle-aged to us, isn't it? Okay. But here in those times they lived a little bit longer. Yeah, probably 30. Yeah, somewhere 25, 30. So he's 40 years old. So, and here we go. He just leaving that, starting his life, the new life. Does that kind of sound like Christ when he began his ministry as a man? We know very little about his childhood. Now you say, well, he was 30. Well, somewhere between 30 and 40, there was Jesus. So we see a very similar thing here. He grew up. We don't have much of his childhood. And bam, he's a man. And now God has laid out a plan for him. But how did he start the plan? By killing somebody. And he run away, right? Where'd he run to? Midian. Midian, with the sheiks of Midian. Well, where do the Midianites come from? They were the children of Ishmael. His distant cousins. And in that land he found who? His wife. And he found God, right? Underneath old Mount, was it Mount Sinai maybe? God will use anything, even something bad, to get you where he wants you to be. You think Moses would have voluntarily left the palace? Left Egypt? Now, I want to put it to you like this. Can you imagine saying, I could be king. And if I'm not king, I could be second. But you know the problem with kings? They don't like to share power. How many times throughout history do you see brothers killing each other not to share power? Go back to Cain and Abel, right? You don't want to share. You want to be the big boy. As many times when... Has anyone ever seen... What's that movie with Leonardo DiCaprio? Man in the Iron Mask? The king had twins. What do? Only one can be king. Most of the time they would kill the younger son. And whoever was born first, that would be king. The other one had wipe out. So there would be no confusion, no war, no problems. You have one king. So God probably realized, I can't leave Moses here. He can never be Pharaoh. I need him here. And he used that horrible thing, that murder, to get him out of where he was comfortable and go completely to the desert. Now, if you're standing anywhere in Egypt and you go left or right of the Nile River, you're going to a desert. There's nothing else out there.
He went from rags to riches. He went from riches to rags.
There you go. And it was that point in time that God knew that he had a leader. He had it, left the desert, crossed the desert, started listening to him, started hearing God. Sometimes we got to go through the desert to hear God. You got to go through the dry time in your life. You got to go through the hard time in your life, the valley as it is, to hear God. And sometimes that valley is long. Sometimes that desert is long and it's hot and dry. But the first time your heart and God's heart meets again, you look back and say, well, it wasn't that bad. Look at I'm here. We always talk about how long it took him to talk about 40 days across the desert. Well, there's not too many people who can live without food for 40 days. Who's one we know did it? Jesus. And where did he wander for 40 days? Wilderness. What's the wilderness? The desert. The wilderness. And now we say the wilderness and we think, we can go out on the mountain, that's the wilderness. That's not wilderness. You go out in the desert where there's no water, there's no food. You can go up on these mountains and you can find water and food. If you're willing to eat what you find. You can live. You may not like the taste of it or what it is, but you can find some. In the desert, you're not going to find a whole lot to eat or drink on. If you find it out there, you probably don't want to eat it and probably don't want to drink it. But people's been existing there for thousands of years, haven't they? They know how to survive in the desert. They get it because they're willing to do what it takes to survive. As he crosses that desert, he's getting close. He thinks he's getting further from everything he knows, and he's actually getting closer to God. Getting closer, getting closer. Get him to where he wants him to be. Get him to where he wants him to be. Now you say, well, how can God use him? He was a murderer. Moses did have some problems. We know Moses had some problems. As we keep going in the study, we'll find out Moses is very short-tempered. Doesn't have a lot of patience. He doesn't even have a lot of patience with God. Anybody else like that? Am I the only? Y'all are dying going to hell. You telling lies. I'm telling you what, sometimes we're very impatient with God. God, I want this and I need it yesterday. It'll help me a lot. Yeah, I need this today. And God said, don't work like that. Let me see if you truly need this. That's what we say, isn't it? I want it now. Sometimes I think we're that little girl off Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. I want a squirrel, Daddy. Or I want one of those geese, Daddy. All right. How much? That's not how God works, is it, folks?
Come on, God, you go ahead and give me this now. I'll do this later.
Yeah. Yeah, let's make a deal, God. I don't think I've ever found that in the Scriptures. If you making a deal with God, God says, here it is. My way or the highway. And you have to... Oh, God, well, I like that plan, but let's do it this way. No. So when we think of Moses, and like he's one of the greatest Bible characters, probably taught more than any other Old Testament Bible character. But when you get right down to study him, the cool stuff is really what we don't see and we want to think about. What he may be educated and what he left behind. You think maybe he had a girlfriend in Egypt? I mean, the man's 40 years old, Prince of Egypt. You don't think he had a girlfriend?
According to the movie, yeah.
Oh, yeah. She was to be the next queen, though, right? She was for the next Pharaoh. What was her in the movie? Nefertiti, I think was her name in the movie. That wasn't quite biblical, but he had to have him a sweetheart. I'll just be honest. He had to. He had to be loved by everybody. He had to be smart. Of course, now he told God that he couldn't talk very good. He did tell that to God, but everywhere you see in the Scriptures, it's Moses talking. So I don't know if he actually had a speech impediment or not, but he had to be educated, he had to be wealthy, he had to be clean, he had to smell good probably, he had to carry authority. Can you imagine going from that to crossing the desert with nothing to eat, no slaves, no servants, and then going into total lifestyle and becoming a shepherd? Most of the Scripture we read in the Bible is going from the shepherd to the king. Right? Jesus was a carpenter, one of the lowliest of professions in that day, and became what? King. King. David, a shepherd boy. King. Solomon, the younger of David's sons, a poet, a scholar, not a warrior, became king over his older brothers. You see that still continuing? The pattern's still going, and it's still creating problems, isn't it? But we see all these things, but this is the first time where we see someone go back. We always see folks, oh, God took me out of this and put me here. Here's someone that God took from being a king to breaking him all the way down to being really a slave. He had to become a slave before he could become the leader. And sometimes I go back and I think, and when we get to these scriptures where it talks about the people wanting to murmur against Moses and kill him, did they not sit back and think of what he left to get them out of Egypt? He could have been their king. And they could have been his slaves. And my mind thinks, did they ever stop and think and say, hey, thank you, Moses? Hey, thank you? Probably not. Because like I said, half the time they wanted to stone him to death. And we don't often think about what people... Now, we don't talk about this a lot. But sometimes we have to sacrifice to serve God. Don't we? We have to sacrifice things in our lives. Whether it be money or power or success. Whatever. Sometimes we have, and that's what Moses had to do. We will never know that kind of sacrifice, what he walked away from. None of us will ever be king of something until the day we go to heaven. Then we become kings and queens. We're joint heirs with Jesus, right? We have a kingdom, so that makes us kings and queens. But we didn't leave that to serve God. And here next Sunday, next Sunday night, we'll get to Moses' return. We'll get to the burning bush and all that, because Hollywood doesn't really do it justice. When we get through all that and see him coming back, we'll see a different Moses. And we'll see a Moses that has been a servant for a number of years, a shepherd for a number of years, a husband now, a father now, and we'll see a completely different person. But as we think about that, let me give you some history. Let me see here. I want to give you some dates and names here, and this is history. This is a matter of record. The Pharaoh that was Pharaoh when the children were thrown to the river was Amenhotep, and he was there from 1532 to 1511. In that time period, Moses' adopted mother, Hatshepsut. And you can actually, if you go online, you can go online and look up pharaohs of Egypt, and it's listed now. They actually just had a special on the History Channel, National Geographic the other day on this Thutmose III, because they honestly thought that was Moses. They thought that was his Egyptian name, because the record of Thutmose III was eliminated from Egyptian culture.
Did you see it online, the big family tree?
Yeah.
27 pages of it. We were going to print it, but we couldn't find it in the Bible.
You probably saw this on there too, didn't you? This little timeline.
Yes, that's what we see.
Yep, that's one of the ones I have saved.
It just kept going and going and going and going, and we thought it wasn't real because we couldn't find it in the Bible.
Yeah, it's not in the Bible. And why would it be in the Bible, you think?
Because it's not important to salvation.
It's not as important to salvation. But remember, where'd this book of the Bible come from? Who wrote it? Moses. Moses wrote it. So he wrote down what God gave him to write. So why would he leave that out? It says very little about him, right? Who did he do most of the talking about? The nation of Israel and what happened. He left himself out. If you look at like the New Testament, the writers in the New Testament leave their self out. They talk about God. They talk about the subject matter. They talk very little about themselves.
You know why? Sign of my voice. Don't, God tells itself, the first will be last.
Yep.
The last will be first. He's given us another example there too, the scriptures. We want to be humble. It's not about us. It's nothing about us. It's all about God.
Because Moses could have wrote volumes about his life, what it was like. Now, as a historian, I'd like to see that. That would be pretty cool to me. But as far as the scriptures, what was important was to know where he came from and what God did.
So we can carry.
That's probably true too. So we could carry the book. Can you imagine if the Bible had everything? I mean,
Be able to carry it.
yeah, I never thought about that. But hey, God's God, right? He knows. Because there's Bibles out there that include, what is it, 8 or 9 more books. Something, 8 or 9 more books. It's got the book of Enoch, and there's several new Old Testament books, the book of Judas. There's several other books that we don't put in our Bible. It would be, even with those, it would be that thick.
Well, 16 and 11, actually, the oldest.
It has several of those in it.
Has
The original Catholic Bible has those in it as well. But they were excluded from that translation to ours. it was very controversial.
Like, why those? Why the...
Well, if you read, well, I don't want to get too far into that because the book of Enoch I've read. You can get it online. You can buy it. It talks a lot about the works of Enoch and what he did, but it also talks about giants in the land and angels and a lot of things that was very controversial to the church. You have to remember when the Bibles were put together, the Catholic Church dominated Christianity. They only want people to know what they wanted them to know. And you say, well, that's horrible, Carl. I'm sorry, that's the way it was. That's the way they wanted to do it. Do I believe my Bible's complete? Absolutely. I think my Bible's complete. I can find salvation in it. I can find everything I need in it.
We find the important stuff.
I can find what I need, not what I want. Now, as a mature Christian, I can go to other sources and look. That's why I like commentaries and histories and things I like to go to. But when I talk about Bible, it's got to come from here. I won't use anything else. Like I said, the book of Enoch is very controversial. The book that I taught you Revelation from is controversial in most churches. It was banned from a lot of churches because it explained what happened in Revelation before most people could understand what was going to happen in Revelation. 50 years ago, Revelation was a complete mystery to people. Nowadays, it's not. It's here. We actually can see that. And when we look back in history and Moses and things, and we see those artifacts, they're just now finding things from that culture. Still to this day, still finding artifacts. And I love to watch those specials when they found out that temple that had all the animals on it. And I shared, they proved two of each one, and there was animals that they would have never seen in that part of the world, ever. But they were on that temple. And, the hair on the back of my neck standing up right now, because I just look at that and I think, thank you, God. But can you imagine what they're going to find next year or next week? They're digging all over the world trying to find things. They're still trying to get permission today to go underneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem to dig, to find artifacts. Because all the temple artifacts are somewhere on earth, somewhere. Nope. And that's where the temple was in Turkey. It was like 10 miles from Mount Ararat. 10 miles from Mount Ararat. And, it was in but it was buried. Everything was torn down, laid down, and buried nice and neatly. Like someone said, I don't want anyone to see this, we're going to lay it down. Why wouldn't people want to find that? Why wouldn't someone want us to find that in the future? It would prove the Word of God. And to leave you with this, every culture on the planet has a flood in their history. Every culture has a flood in their history that covered the entire world. And even science has proved that our tallest mountain at one time was underwater. Is that a coincidence, church? No. There's no such thing. It's the will of God. It's the plan of God. But I don't want us to get too hung up on names and things, but I'm glad we looked and said, well, that's not in the Bible. And it's not. Those things are not in the Bible. But history does go along with our Bibles on that. And it doesn't matter, really, the names of those people, I'll just be honest with you. It's cool. It's just cool to see them. And it's cool to think that Moses' stepmother ruled Egypt for about 18 years. Because her son was little. She ruled while her son was a baby. Then it's actually rumored that he had her killed. Because he didn't want her to have any more power. And yes, it's cool because women can't be pharaohs because pharaohs are men. So they put a beard on her, a helmet just like a pharaoh, and made her into a man. Every picture that you see on a wall of her, it doesn't show her as a woman. It shows her as a man. Because a pharaoh could not be a woman.
Okay, what was the one that you asked us to look up? Who he was raised with? Was that Moses the third? Okay, we found somebody by the name of Jebubeth. Do you know who that was?
Who?
Genubath.
That's a Hebrew word, I believe, isn't it?
I don't know, but we found somebody.
We found somebody by that name.
In the scriptures?
Yeah,
That may be,
it was in First Kings somewhere, like, I can't remember.
I have to look that one up. That's a Hebrew name.
That name, yeah.
That's a Hebrew name. That may be, because many times Hebrews had more than one name. Because if you look at like in the disciples, John Mark, Simon Peter, they had more than one name. That could be, it could be Aaron. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with that. I'll have to look it up, but I'll look it up and get back to you. Because many times they actually change their names when they become older, come into their manhood. They would change their names. Questions, comments?